as nothing to what they will be from this day forward.
Big practical questions, Nick, about location and date and all the rest of it, and we'll be back with you in a second to talk about that. Thank you for now. Because we'll have a little more on the royal wedding later in the programme. But now let's take a look at the day's other main news, because the Irish government has been forced once again to deny that it's asked the EU for emergency financial help to ease the debt crisis. Brian Cowen, the Prime Minister, said that the Irish economy was well funded until next year and that his ministers were cooperating with European partners. EU finance ministers have been meeting in Brussels to consider how the problem can be contained. Gavin Hewitt's report contains some flash photography.
The cameras were waiting today for the man who is seen to be at the centre of the latest Eurozone crisis. Brian Lenihan, the Irish finance minister, came to Brussels for a crucial meeting, knowing that some officials and some countries want Ireland to accept a bailout.
The Irish state is fully funded into the middle of next year. Clearly there are difficulties in the market, and we'll be discussing this evening how we address those difficulties.
Brussels is scared that the Irish debt crisis risks spreading to other countries like Portugal. And the President of the European Council said today that the very survival of the European Union was at stake.
The first year of the Lisbon Treaty has been clearly marked by the crisis of the Eurozone. It was not a period of vision, it was a period of survival. It's not over yet.
You could sense too the tension in the Irish Parliament as the Prime Minister Brian Cowen defended policies that have rocked financial markets.
Dealing with a crisis of such magnitude. I say that fully. I say that fully.
Ireland's problems go back to the property bubble that burst. It has left Ireland with ghost towns and left its banks deeply in debt. The government has taken over these debts and the country now has a deficit of over 30% of GDP. The problem is that the financial markets do not believe that austerity alone can solve Ireland's debt problems. Most people today seemed resigned at the prospect of a bailout.
That's what we joined the EU for support in emergencies. And we do have an emergency here at the moment.
If it has to happen, it has to happen. And maybe a quick, sharp solution might help.
Ireland's problems are forcing up the cost of borrowing elsewhere in the Eurozone, and some countries still want Ireland to accept a limited bailout, perhaps of its banks, to calm the markets.
If the markets don't actually swallow whatever sort of wheeze they construct, then we could be back here again in a couple of weeks. And what we see in the Eurozone at the moment is a series of these sort of mushrooming crises followed by an ad hoc solution.
For a fragile Irish government, any bailout would be a humiliation. But what emerged here tonight was the potential framework of a rescue plan for Ireland's banks were Ireland to call for help. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Brussels.
Well, to try to make a little more sense of this, let's talk to our economics editor, Stephanie Flanders. Stephanie, we have the Irish government repeatedly denying that it needs any kind of bailout. So why is that talk still continuing?
Well, as ever, Hugh, you've got the root of the problem, and then you've got the reason why investors are focusing on it now as opposed to last month or next year. The root of the problem isn't Ireland's weak economy. It's not even its 12% of national income budget deficit, which it's had to take extraordinary efforts to bring down. The problem is this promise they made a couple of years ago to guarantee every penny not only deposited in Irish banks, but also every penny lent by Irish banks, these hundreds of billions of euros of loans that they took on at the height of the boom. And I think that the problem has been that investors have looked at the size of those and just thought these can't be, the taxpayers can't stand behind them. The reason they're focused on it right now is that European ministers have started to talk about in the future needing to restructure European government debt in a future crisis. Investors have wondered, gosh, that means we may actually have the debt we're holding now get restructured as well, and that spooked the market. So the ministers who are meeting tonight in Brussels were very keen to draw a line under this. They would like to have a bank restructuring deal for Ireland, but they know that the etiquette of these things is Ireland has to ask, and they feel a bit awkward pushing Ireland into it when at least the last few weeks of problems has been pretty much down to them.
Stephanie, for now, thank you very much. Stephanie Flanders there, our economics editor. A formal timetable for NATO to hand over security duties to local forces in Afghanistan will apparently be finalised later this week. A summit in Lisbon, attended by President Obama and David Cameron, among others, is expected to set 2014 as the new target date. This week, we're reporting from Afghanistan on the challenge facing NATO forces, especially the 9,000 British personnel stationed there. The BBC's George Alagiah is in Helmand province, and we can join him there tonight.
Thanks, Huw, and good evening. British commanders here now insist that the troop surge is having a real impact, pushing the insurgents out of the towns and villages and into the countryside. But they also warn that progress is fragile, so the question remains, when will Afghan troops be ready to hold back an insurgency that remains as resilient as it is deadly? Our correspondent Paul Wood reports now on a mission still hanging in the balance.
Illumination rounds. The Taliban could be out there, and the soldiers of the Royal Irish Regiment want to see them coming. There's been almost 5 years of this in Helmand, but British commanders insist progress is being made in places like this, the small town of Nad Ali. The Royal Irish move out. A month-long offensive has driven the Taliban back in the countryside around the town. Only a week ago, this whole area was under Taliban control, but the surge of forces in Afghanistan means that British soldiers like these are going to places where NATO never really had a presence before. But pushing the Taliban out might be the easy part. Holding this ground could be far more difficult. For that, NATO must rely on these men, the Afghan police. In the past, they had a terrible reputation for bribery and corruption. That made local people turn to the Taliban. But NATO hopes this new generation of police are different. Their job is certainly dangerous, this the heavily sandbagged police post. All these men were injured in firefights with the insurgents. Some were stopped at Taliban checkpoints on their way to work. Just wearing a police uniform here is an act of courage.
I'm the ISAF commander. My name is Wally. Is he happy? Are you happy with ISAF being in the area?
Yeah, he said we are so happy for security.
But in the area's main bazaar, Afghans we spoke to were largely hostile to the international forces. We were better off before the foreign troops arrived, he says. There was enough food and there wasn't shooting all the time. I'm 50, and since they came, my beard has turned white. The foreigners should leave.
Everything has been positive thus far, but this is a long game, and the insurgent has the ability and experience and is proven to adapt, and we'll just have to see how they adapt. But again, we're constantly adapting our tactics as well, and we've got to think ahead and beat him to that counter-reaction.
Okay, there's 2 compounds of insurgents firing on the ISAF. The patrol we've joined gets a call for help. British soldiers have come under fire about 1 kilometre away.
It's too late now.
Hey?
It's now too late to go.
It's not too late, they're still there. The police officer on duty isn't keen to get involved, but he's persuaded. The British troops set off to look for the insurgents. It's thought they've taken shelter in a nearby mosque after carrying out their ambush. It is tense. The troops expect to get